A severed head can stay conscious for as long as 30 seconds after decapitation. This gruesome half-minute can include blinking eyes, lips trying to form words, and a lingering awareness as life slowly slips away. For Anne Boleyn, the second wife of Henry VIII and arguably the most famous queen to be executed, this chilling possibility was just one part of her execution that historical accounts often gloss over. The real account of Anne's last moments uncovers a psychological torment that's much more unsettling than just the act of swinging a sword. It was a deliberate political performance aimed at annihilating not only her physical form, but also her enduring legacy. Anne's execution serves as a grim reminder of Tudor England's harsh justice system, where death was simply the final outcome of a meticulously planned humiliation. While numerous history books merely state that she was executed for treason, the truth about her last days reveals a psychological breakdown so systematic that it would astound even today's torturers. Her execution wasn't merely a conclusion, it represented the last move in Henry VIII's effort to eliminate a woman who had become too powerful for his liking. By May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn had spent 17 days in prison at the Tower of London, the very place where she had once prepared for her coronation. Just 3 years prior, she had been crowned Queen of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. Now, she found herself in a haunting limbo, awaiting her fate as Henry VIII cruelly prolonged her psychological torment. The king had even called in a skilled swordsman from Killala to carry out the execution instead of relying on the usual English axe. This choice is often portrayed as an act of mercy, but it really highlighted the dramatic spectacle of what was about to happen. In her last hours, Anne displayed an eerie sense of calm, with witnesses noting that she appeared cheerful even while getting ready to face her death. Modern psychologists might identify this as dissociation, a defense mechanism that kicks in during extreme trauma. She was said to have joked about being known as Anne sans tête, lacking a head, which was a darkly humorous way to hide her deep inner struggles. However, not many historical records recognize the intense fear she likely experienced. Fully aware that her reputation was being systematically shattered by false claims of adultery, incest, and plotting to murder the king, what makes Anne's execution especially unsettling isn't just the brutal act of beheading, it's the deliberate obliteration of her identity. Henry didn't merely wish for Anne to die, he aimed to erase her from history entirely. He sought to invalidate her contributions and delegitimize her daughter, Elizabeth. This execution was the final outcome of a calculated campaign to tarnish her character, crafted to convince the English people that their once adored queen deserved this grim fate. In the days leading up to her death, Anne was subjected to shocking and false stories about her supposed sexual misconduct. These accusations were so ridiculous that they would be thrown out by any present-day court. On the morning of May 19th, the sun shone unusually bright over London, creating a sharp contrast to the grim events that were about to happen. Anne had spent her last night in prayer, but she found it difficult to sleep. Tower records showed that she asked for the sacrament at 2:30 a.m., spending hours kneeling before the host in a state of desperate communion. By dawn, she had been awake for almost 24 hours, and it's clear that stress and exhaustion had taken a toll on her mind. When the tower's tenant came to get her, she was said to be laughing with her ladies, a response that suggests not tranquility, but rather a psychological breakdown. Anne's execution had been set and pushed back numerous times, a form of psychological torment that often goes unnoticed. The constant uncertainty about the exact timing of her death was a calculated strategy employed against prisoners. When she was finally told that the moment had come, Anne was escorted from her chambers through the same corridors where, just 3 years earlier, she had walked as the queen-to-be. Now, the guards were positioned beside her, not out of honor, but to make sure she didn't try to flee. The same courtiers who had once shown her respect now observed her last moments with a cold detachment. The scaffold built on Tower Green was surprisingly low, just 3 feet off the ground, unlike the high platforms often seen in movies. This intentional design meant that Anne only had to climb a few steps, stripping her of any sense of dignity and bringing her closer to the mocking crowd. While contemporary portrayals usually depict a serious and respectful assembly, historical accounts indicate that a festive atmosphere was actually promoted. The execution served as a public spectacle, a warning to anyone who might oppose the king's power, especially women who aspired to rise above their roles. Before she knelt at the block, Anne was allowed to deliver a final address, not as an act of compassion, but simply because tradition required it. Her carefully chosen words showcased both her political savvy and her dire situation. Good Christian people, I have come here to die. She recognized that the law had deemed her deserving of death, and so she would not speak out against it. Yet this seeming acceptance of her fate was actually her last act of defiance. By acknowledging the law without confessing guilt, she quietly questioned the validity of the accusations leveled against her. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect was the king's absence. Unlike the traditional public display of royal executions, Henry VIII chose not to be present. Instead, he waited at Whitehall Palace for news of Anne's death. While the sword separated her head from her body, Henry was reportedly celebrating his impending marriage to Jane Seymour, a harsh reminder of how thoroughly Anne had been cast aside. The personal had turned into something political, and Anne's death was just an unfortunate but necessary step in the king's quest for a male heir. The swordsman from Killala had specifically asked for this task and paid a significant amount for his skills, showcasing a deeper layer of calculated cruelty. Unlike typical English executions that employed an axe and often needed several strikes to fully remove the head, this was a different scenario altogether. The French swordsman was known for being able to decapitate in one swift motion, but Anne had never seen him before. In her last moments, she would confront her death at the hands of someone she didn't know, adding to the humiliation for a queen who had once held the focus of all England. The blindfold they put on her, often portrayed as an act of mercy to shield her from the sight of the blade, actually had a more pragmatic reason. It kept her from flinching at the critical moment, which could lead to a failed execution. Anne chose to kneel upright instead of resting her head on a block, which was another French custom that made the executioner's task even more difficult. This stance required her to stay still purely by willpower, keeping her calm even as the swordsman got ready to deliver the fatal blow. Onlookers noted that she was constantly moving her lips in prayer, her eyes shifting beneath the blindfold as she tried to catch any sound of the oncoming blade. The psychological anguish of this moment, recognizing that death is imminent but uncertain when, reflects a kind of suffering that is seldom recognized in polished historical stories. The beheading itself was remarkably swift by Tudor standards. With a single strike, Anne's head was removed. Yet what ensued right after is frequently left out of respectful historical discussions. A witness reported that her eyes and lips kept moving for several seconds after her decapitation, which is a shocking physiological reaction that happens when there's still oxygen in the brain tissue. Some even claimed that her lips appeared to form words, possibly continuing the prayer that was cut short by the sword. The scene was so unsettling that several onlookers fainted, while others had to turn away in horror at this grim reminder of the fragile link between the body and the soul. Perhaps the most significant detail is that no proper coffin was arranged for Anne's remains. Her ladies-in-waiting, filled with grief and shock, had to hastily search for an arrow chest to contain her head and body. This seemingly small oversight reveals a great deal about the utter lack of respect for Anne's dignity. Even in death, she was treated as an afterthought, a political issue resolved rather than as a person worthy of fundamental respect. She was buried quickly in an unmarked grave in the Tower Chapel, without a proper Christian ceremony, as if the king wanted her memory to disappear just as swiftly as her life had. Henry's efforts to erase Anne didn't stop with her death. He ordered court painters to destroy any portraits of her. Her royal symbols were removed from the palace walls, and courtiers soon figured out that mentioning her name could result in royal disapproval. While we typically concentrate on the actual act of execution, the systematic eradication of Anne's existence signifies a type of violence that goes beyond her death. It was an effort to erase not just an individual, but a legacy. It took centuries for historians to embark on the meticulous task of piecing together Anne's life from the remnants that survived Henry's purge. Anne's execution deeply affected those who were forced to watch, especially her ladies-in-waiting. They had the grim responsibility of cleaning and preparing her severed head for burial. These women, fearful of being linked to the Queen's supposed crimes, had to carry out this horrific task while keeping their composure. Many of them reportedly endured nightmares for years, and at least one chose to enter a convent, finding it impossible to continue living in court after witnessing such a traumatic event. The impact of psychological trauma reached well beyond Anne, fostering a pervasive atmosphere of fear that affected Henry's court for the rest of his reign. Right after the execution, Anne's daughter Elizabeth, who was not even 3 years old, was deemed illegitimate and taken out of the line of succession. The child destined to become England's greatest queen found herself effectively orphaned. With her mother executed and her father publicly denying her legitimacy, court records revealed that Elizabeth suddenly lacked the proper clothing and attendance befitting her former status. Her household fell apart almost overnight. This harsh treatment of a young child adds another layer to the tragedy surrounding Anne's execution, extending the punishment to her innocent daughter. Many modern portrayals of Tudor executions fail to convey the intense sensory experience of the scene. The scaffold would have been stained with the blood from prior executions, buzzing with flies in the warmth of May. The crowd's roar, fueled by supporters who were told to cheer at the Queen's death, created a deafening sound meant to disorient and frighten her. She would have heard this uproar getting louder as she neared Tower Green. The jeers and insults came from a public encouraged to see her as a witch and an adulteress. This carefully planned public humiliation was a crucial aspect of Tudor justice. Merely dying was never seen as enough punishment. While popular culture often portrays Anne's final speech as a moment of dignified defiance, historical accounts paint a more complex picture. Her carefully crafted words praising the king as a kind and sovereign lord reveal the impossible situation she found herself in. Even in the face of certain death, Anne found it hard to speak her mind. Her words were limited by her worries about her daughter's future and the reactions of the crowd around her. Rather than expressing herself freely, her speech highlighted the lack of freedom. It was the ultimate form of censorship for a woman who understood that even her last words would be relayed to the king and could affect the lives of those she would leave behind. The sword that took Anne's life, specially brought in from France, represents the dramatic nature of her execution. Henry went all out to create a spectacle fitting for a queen's demise. It's said that the executioner even practiced on animals ahead of time, intent on delivering the precise single stroke that would secure his significant payment. This detached professionalism, turning Anne's death into a mere technical challenge, highlights the dehumanization that comes with state-sanctioned executions. Anne wasn't simply killed, she was funneled through a system meant to convert human pain into political statements. Historical accounts indicate that no English executioner would take on the task, not due to any moral concerns, but because the French sword technique demanded specific training. The blade was incredibly sharp and had a different weight compared to an English axe, as it was crafted for a quick horizontal strike instead of the typical downward chop. This detail highlights the dramatic aspect of Anne's execution. The choice of execution method was also made with great care to create the most impact while keeping the process tidy, ensuring that the event would unfold without the embarrassment of a failed beheading. After the sword struck, Thomas Wyatt, who was also imprisoned in the Tower and forced to witness the execution of a woman he once admired, wrote about the delicate throat that had once been adorned with so many jewels. His poignant words reflect the shocking change of Anne from a revered queen to a lifeless corpse. Her severed head was quickly wrapped in linen by her grieving ladies, but not before the executioner raised it high by the hair. This traditional act was meant to show the crowd that the sentence had been carried out. The sight of the head held up, with blood still flowing from the severed arteries, created a powerful image that would remain etched in the memories of those who witnessed it. Tower records show that Anne's remains were buried so quickly that she received almost no proper Christian burial rites. The chest holding her head and body was placed under the chapel floor alongside the remains of other executed nobles. It was a disgraceful end for a Queen of England. No marker was ever put in place to show where she was buried, leaving her exact resting spot a mystery for centuries. This erasure of even her burial site highlights the extent of Henry's efforts to erase Anne from not only life but also from history itself. A campaign that came close to succeeding. In the aftermath of the execution, Henry's propagandists put in a lot of effort to influence the public narrative. Court poets who once celebrated Anne's intelligence and beauty now wrote poems denouncing her as a manipulative traitor. Official narratives highlighted the king's kindness in choosing a skilled swordsman instead of the usual methods, portraying Henry's dramatic decision as a compassionate gesture. The gruesome details of the execution were carefully softened in official documents, starting a centuries-long trend of historical revision that still shapes how we view Anne's last moments. One of the most unsettling aspects for today's perspectives is how rapidly life resumed for Henry VIII. Just a day after Anne's execution, he officially got engaged to Jane Seymour. In less than 2 weeks after sending his second wife to the scaffold, Henry tied the knot with his third wife in a simple ceremony at Whitehall Palace. This ruthless pace shows that the execution was just an easy fix for a political issue. Anne didn't produce a male heir, so she was done away with and substituted. The personal tragedy of her death was entirely overshadowed by the needs of statecraft and the pursuit of a dynasty. The psychological impact of Anne's execution went far beyond the scaffold. For weeks leading up to her death, she endured constant interrogation, was deprived of adequate sleep, and kept away from her supporters. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister who orchestrated the accusations against her, used methods strikingly akin to contemporary psychological torture, including disorientation, sleep deprivation, isolation, and the calculated dissemination of false information. By the time Anne arrived at the scaffold, she had gone through a relentless mental assault, aimed at making sure she wouldn't put up any significant resistance at the end. Court documents show the exceptional security measures put in place for Anne's execution, which were far more extensive than what was typical for even the most notorious traitors. The number of guards at the tower was increased, and special sentries were placed all around the fortress. These measures weren't meant to stop anyone from escaping. Instead, they were in place to make sure that no one could try to intervene at the last moment or stir up public support against the execution. This show of strength had another aim as well. It was meant to intimidate anyone who might feel sympathy for Anne, forcing them to quietly accept the king's decision. The execution was set for mid-morning instead of the usual dawn, which made it easier for more Londoners to attend. While Tower Green could only hold a small number of nobles and officials, the height of the tower allowed the crowds outside to hear when the event was over. Church bells across London would ring out, marking the moment of death and serving as a citywide recognition of royal authority. This arrangement turned Anne's private anguish into a public spectacle. It made death a form of political theatre instead of a personal loss. One of the most neglected details about Anne's execution is what happened to her co-accused. Of 5 men, one of whom was her brother George Boleyn, were executed just days before Anne. They were charged with committing adultery with the Queen. Their executions were meant to solidify the claims against Anne before her own execution, ensuring that their last words wouldn't challenge the official story. This orchestrated judicial killing of 6 individuals, all found guilty based on nearly identical false evidence, marks one of England's most audacious acts of state violence. A purge reminiscent of Stalin's show trials occurred centuries later. Today, Tower Green has a memorial that marks the general area where Anne was executed. But records from that time suggest the actual scaffold was positioned in a different part of the tower complex. This mix up in location symbolizes how Anne's death has been continually reinterpreted and moved both in a physical sense and through history to support various narratives. The romanticized portrayal of her execution in popular culture is far removed from the psychological torment, character destruction, and deliberate cruelty that defined her last days in May 1536. The true horror of Anne Boleyn's execution goes beyond the act of beheading. It reflects the end of a well-planned effort to dismantle a woman who had ascended too high for the comfort of Tudor society. She wasn't just executed. She was methodically dismantled, her reputation shattered, her accomplishments rendered insignificant, and her very being almost wiped from the pages of history. When we consider the complete backdrop of her last days, the mental anguish, the public shaming, the deliberate dramatics, and the efforts to obliterate her memory, we face a nightmare that's much more unsettling than a quick blow from a sword. From a contemporary psychological viewpoint, Anne's execution serves as a case study in state-sponsored manipulation and public defamation. The accusations leveled against her, which included having affairs with several men, even her brother, and plotting to poison the king, were so ridiculous that they wouldn't hold up in any present-day courtroom. However, by skillfully shaping public perception, strategically employing torture to obtain confessions from co-accused individuals, and controlling all official accounts, Henry's government effectively persuaded many that Anne was deserving of her punishment. This deliberate distortion of reality is arguably the most chilling aspect of her execution. 5 centuries later, the execution of Anne Boleyn still captivates people because it embodies the clash between personal tragedy and political strategy. Her death was not just the conclusion of her life, it was a meticulously staged event meant to legitimize a king's decisions and alter the way history is remembered. The real terror isn't just in the instant the sword struck, but in understanding how utterly power can distort reality. This lesson feels particularly relevant today as we navigate an age filled with information manipulation and attacks on character. Anne's ultimate tragedy might be that despite Henry's relentless attempts to wipe her from existence, it was her death, rather than her life, that turned out to be her most lasting legacy. To truly grasp the full horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, we must face some uncomfortable truths regarding power, gender, and how history is shaped. The sanitized depiction of her death as that of an unfortunate queen who met a swift and dignified end hides the systematic abuse of state power that her situation illustrates. By delving into the psychological aspects of her execution, we uncover the intentional torment, the public humiliation, the damage to her reputation, and the efforts to erase her memory. So, we not only understand the concept of justice in Tudor, but also how authority sustains itself by controlling both people and the stories told about them. Anne's severed head serves as a reminder of how delicate truth can be when faced with overwhelming power.